What part did Admiral George Morrison have to play in the Gulf of Tonkin?
Well, I mean, by necessity, he was a key conspirator because the ships were under his command. He was the commanding officer. He controlled those two ships. So, I mean, this whole thing could not have been fabricated without his full and complete cooperation. Obviously, I mean, he had to be fully on board this scam, and he was the main man there in the in the theater of operations. So obviously he had to be on board this scam that drew America into the Vietnam quagmire. And at that very same time, I mean, absolutely simultaneous with those events, this whole music scene started to take shape, like virtually overnight, in Laurel Canyon, and all these bands that were to become superstars. We had the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Doors, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, the Mamas and the Papas. They were sort of the first wave of bands, and then they were followed by many, many others after that. But they were the first wave. And one of the very first people on that scene, in late 64, early 65, was, of course, the infamous Jim Morrison, lead singer of the Doors, who is, small world that it is, the son of Admiral George Stephen Morrison.
Right, what a coincidence.
Well, yeah, I mean, is that just bizarre or what? While the father is over actively collaborating in constructing this hoax that will be used to escalate the war, at the very same time, the son is over here positioning himself to become this great icon of the peace and love generation.
Right, the Pied Piper.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Let me ask you something. Your article said that Jim Morrison was a self-proclaimed lizard king.
He had a lot of labels. He had the Lizard King, Mr. Mojo Rising. He had quite a few labels that he attached to himself.
I always felt intuitively, Dave, that the hippies and the flower power kids that were all, to me, I was in my early 20s, I just thought they were really dirty. I separated myself from them big time. But I always felt that they were set up to actually quash the anti-war movement, especially with all the drugs and Timothy Leary, tune in, drop out, and all of this. It was more like they were leading people down a path away from the anti-war movement to just get stoned and not give a damn.
Exactly. I mean, Leary said that explicitly. I mean, at one point he told a crowd that he told people, you want to know what to do about the Vietnam War? Just turn your back on it. Just forget about it. I mean, that was his advice. And yeah, if you look through the songbooks of these bands, you're not going to find a whole lot of overtly anti-war songs. What you find is promotion of the Leary agenda, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the turn on, tune in, drop out. That's what you find in, if you really look.
Don't you think Leary was probably part of a CIA op to get kids onto drugs and out of the anti-war movement?
Oh, absolutely. I think he was just one of many. At this point, I mean, I pretty much believe that the whole, I think the whole thing was a fabrication, and I think it was, a deliberate effort to disarm or to diffuse or whatever the anti-war movement, the growing anti-war movement. They knew there was already an anti-war movement in place, and they knew it was going to escalate considerably with the escalation of the war, obviously, and so I think they were prepared for that, and they concocted this scheme to create this whole sort of hippie counterculture and equate that with the anti-war movement, even though they were actually two separate, entities. And in that way, it became much easier to marginalize and discredit the anti-war movement if, all people saw on TV were these long-haired, unwashed, drugged out hippies, decked out in peace signs and all this kind of stuff. And that was much easier to marginalize than the original anti-war movement, which, pretty much started on college campuses and was composed of respectable professors and their students and whatnot. And, the hippies were much easier to marginalize.
Right. Let's get over.
After I discovered, this Jim Morrison, who exactly Jim Morrison was, I decided maybe to dig a little deeper into some of these other people. And I mean, I was rather amazed actually how easy it was to find out the background on these people. And I mean, right down the line, you look at all the major characters from the LA music scene, you know, the genesis of the hippie scene, and every damn one of them is from a military/intelligence background. Every one of them. I mean, Frank Zappa's dad was a chemist at the Edgewood Arsenal, for crying out loud. I mean, he was a chemical warfare technician at one of the most notorious facilities in the country. You know, I mean, there's just all kinds of evil that has emanated from that place. You know, I mean, anybody that's done any kind of conspiracy research knows, you know, all about the Edgewood Arsenal, and that's where Frank Zappa's dad worked, and that's where Frank Zappa grew up and went to school. They actually lived in military housing on the base, and Frank attended the Edgewood School there. He was born, raised and educated at the Edgewood Arsenal, of all places. And he again became this, you know, huge icon of the flower power generation. He was actually very right-wing, very authoritarian personality, described repeatedly as a control freak, as you know, this very authoritarian type of guy. He was actually pro-war. He vigorously pro-capitalist. He actually boycotted some countries where he was asked to, invited to come on tour because he didn't agree with their politics. I mean, he was, by no stretch of the imagination was he a liberal or left-winger or, you know, whatever you would associate with the, you know, 60s counterculture. And yet, there he was as a shining icon. In fact, he occupied a home that was like a major meeting place, the old Tom Mix cabin, where anyone who was anyone in the mid to late 60s spent time at that cabin. I mean, he was sort of the godfather of Laurel Canyon for a while. And yeah, I mean, his background and his politics are just wildly at odds with, you know.
Now, Zappa's manager was also a former Marine.
Zappa's manager, Herb Cohen, yes, who was a former U.S. Marine who, after he got out of the Marines, spent a few years traveling the world, supposedly, you know, as a civilian. And yet, if you look at his travel itinerary, you find out that he was, like, in places where he really shouldn't have been, you know. And that's the case with a lot, you know. John Phillips was in Cuba at the height of the Cuban Revolution, you know, and then a few years later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was camped out next to a naval base in Jacksonville for 2 weeks, you know. And Herb Cohen, I believe, was in the Congo at the time that Patrice Lumumba was tortured and offed by the CIA.
Right.
So not only do they have these military and intelligence family connections, but the people that they surrounded themselves with later, you know, their managers and attorneys and agents and whatnot, have military and intelligence background.